Good afternoon, folks. I hope everybody is doing well. This is going to be part 2 of our biology lesson on animal nutrition and digestion. If you have not already watched part 1, I recommend that you go and do that so that you have the necessary background for the material we are about to get into. And if you are in my biology class, you should probably go on the Blackboard site and download the handout so that you have important vocabulary and a summary of the basic concepts in front of you. So, last time we left off having established kind of the fundamentals of animal nutrition. We talked about dietary strategies such as substrate feeding, filter feeding, bulk feeding, and so forth. We also talked about, I guess that's more feeding strategies, I should say. Dietary strategies would be more things like we talked about being a carnivore, herbivore, and omnivore, and whether that's an obligate or facultative behavior. We also talked about the various things that you as an animal need food for, and that included ATP production, biosynthesis, the provision of essential nutrients such as amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins, and minerals, and a little bit about some of the things animals require in that regard. And along the way, we also talked a little bit about endotherms needing to burn off some fuel exclusively for purposes of making heat. So we now have the basic model of what animals need from their food, why animals need to eat, and how they select what they need to eat. So now what I want to get into is a little bit more about the actual structures responsible for doing that. Now, this gets us to discussion of digestive systems. Now, fundamentally, every digestive system has 4 basic functions. I may have said this the first lesson, I don't recall. But first off, ingestion, I-N-G-E-S-T-I-O-N, that is taking in the food, putting it into your face, or equivalent structure if you don't have a face, if you're an animal lacking that. 2, digestion, that is the breakdown of your food, which is both physical or mechanical digestion, breaking it apart into small bits via chewing or churning with stomach acids, and then enzymatic or chemical digestion, which is reducing the food to individual molecules such as amino acids, fatty acids, simple sugars, and so forth. Then absorption, that is picking up the nutrients and water taken in with your food, absorbing it, transferring it to the bloodstream, where then it can be distributed to the rest of the body. And then finally, elimination, which is the removal of non-digestible matter when all is said and done. All animal digestive systems have to do those basic things. Now, there are 2 basic kinds of digestion that we can think about with animals. We can talk about intracellular digestion and extracellular digestion. Intracellular, I-N-T-R-A, intracellular within the cell. That means the breakdown of food particles inside the cellular environment. This is a situation in which the cell engulfs food particles via endocytosis of some sort, usually phagocytosis, and then breaks them down internally with the help of lysozymes and similar enzymes. Now, this is a thing that some cells can do in multicellular life. This is also a thing that certain forms of animal do as their default form of digestion. If you are a sponge, for example, virtually all of your digestion, actually all of your digestion, is intracellular digestion, that the nutrients taken in by sponges are pumped through the pores in the animal's body and then captured by individual cells, which engulf them and then take the nutrients out of them. So a sponge doesn't have a digestive system. Every individual cell is essentially on its own, collecting nutrients from the environment. Most animals, however, engage in extracellular digestion, meaning that they are digesting their food in compartments in the body outside of the cell, that the animal has specialized spaces within its body for the processing of food where all these functions that I have described take place. You might recall earlier that I said that animals, one of the defining features of being an animal is that most animals exhibit internal digestion. That is, they process their nutrients inside of the body and then absorb the nutrients internally rather than processing them on the outside. Let's contrast this with another heterotroph, a fungus, where fungi are heterotrophic like us. They need food, but unlike us, they secrete digestive enzymes, break down the food outside of their structure, and then absorb it, whereas we put the food into our structure. and we absorb it. Now, the very simplest digestive system in animals, and it's not even calling it a digestive system is a very loose descriptor, is the thing called a gastrovascular cavity. Gastrovascular, gastrovascular. And take that word apart, gastro for stomach, vascular for vessels. The gastrovascular cavity is a space in the animal's body that functions as both a respiratory organ and a digestive organ. Basically, the animal has a singular internal cavity with one opening that acts as both mouth and anus. There is no digestive tube. The animal has a sac-shaped body with one opening to the outside environment. Food goes into that opening. Non-digested material goes out through the same opening. Likewise, that opening takes in water from the surrounding environment, and the animal engages in gas exchange across that internal membrane. The lining of the gastrovascular cavity is used for both absorption of nutrients and for gas exchange. Now, I said from the water around the animal because all animals with a gastrovascular cavity are marine animals, or more, I should put it this way, aquatic animals, not necessarily marine animals. The term marine refers specifically to saltwater animals, but let's say aquatic animals in general. Your gastrovascular cavity is typically found in very, very simple animals, most notably members of the phylum Cnidaria, which that would include, you might recall, your jellies, your corals, your anemones, your hydras. All of these organisms have that basic bag-shaped body with that internal lining, one singular mouth-like opening, usually surrounded by some kind of feeding tentacles that act to pull food into the animal's interior. The food is then digested inside that singular internal body space. The lining absorbs both nutrients and gases. Waste material is passed out through the same opening. Now, a gastrovascular cavity works pretty well when you have a very simple animal that is exclusively aquatic, when you have an animal with a very simple body plan with a thin body wall, a situation in which that membrane can absorb nutrients, and from there they can be readily passed to every cell in the organism's body without it needing a specialized circulatory system. Your cnidarians do not have distinct circulatory, respiratory, or digestive tracts. They have a body wall that's only a couple of cell layers thick. Nutrients diffuse across the membrane of the gastrovascular cavity and are easily then absorbed by every cell in the animal's body. Likewise, the entire lining of its body is its respiratory membrane, so it doesn't need a distinct circulatory system and respiratory system. That's a simple body plan, few parts to maintain, anatomically straightforward, not terribly energetically expensive to manage. It, however, is not necessarily an efficient body plan because you're using the same opening for loss of waste as well as intake of food. Inevitably, you're going to pass out undigested material whenever you're taking in more fluid to take in more food, or whenever you're taking in fluid for purposes of gas exchange. It is not the most efficient way of getting stuff to your system, and as such, all animals with a gastrovascular cavity are going to be ectothermic. They're going to be cold-blooded animals because they, quite frankly, do not have the sophistication needed to get energy and oxygen any more efficiently than that. But they do what they need to do. It works for them. Now, most animals are going to have a more complex system than this. If you are an animal with a thicker body in which you have more cell layers in your walls and you have bilateral symmetry, you're not going to have a gastrovascular cavity. Instead, you are going to have what is called an alimentary canal. A-L-I-M-E-N-T-A-R-Y, alimentary canal. The alimentary canal is a complete digestive tract, T-R-A-C-T, tract, meaning a continuous tube. So an alimentary canal is a continuous tube with two distinct openings in the animal's body, a mouth at one end and the anus at the other end. Typically, the mouth is going to be at the proximal or superior end of the body. The anus will be at the distal or inferior end of the body. That digestive tract normally has a one-way flow. Material comes in through the mouth. That is what mouths are for. Material goes out through the anus. That's what the anus is for. You have a single passageway through which your material that you're processing is going to pass and just move seamlessly through as it undergoes all the steps of digestion. Now, having an alimentary canal is a much more efficient thing to have than a gastrovascular cavity. For starters, the one-way flow of material means that an animal with an alimentary canal can more effectively extract nutrients and not gases because you don't need them for this, nutrients from the food. That you're passing it all along. It goes from one end to the other end continuously. You don't have to worry about expelling it before you're finished processing it through the same opening it came in through. Secondly, having a long continuous tube that you move all the way down provides more opportunity for nutrient absorption. The animal with the alimentary canal can take in more of the nutrition in the food than an animal with a gastrovascular cavity. Thirdly, that alimentary canal is exclusively a digestive tract. It's not dedicated to respiration or anything else. Ergo, it has specialized structures suited to that particular job. It is better at doing that. Fourthly, that tube can have multiple distinct compartments along the way. It can have a number of distinct digestive containers, often closed off from one another with muscular sphincters, S-P-H-I-N-C-T-E-R. A sphincter is a ring-shaped muscle that opens or closes a passageway. By having multiple distinct compartments controlled by sphincters, you can have different parts of the digestive tract doing different things. Basically, you can have a sequence of digestive organs, and in that way, you can put the food through a more complex set of processing tasks, which again increases the efficiency with which you can break it down and extract nutrients from it. Finally, one big advantage of an alimentary canal is that by having this long continuous tube through the body, you can take in more food while you're still processing a previous meal. While you are eating dinner tonight, your lunch is still in your digestive tract. It is still making its way slowly through. Just by way of example, in the human body, an average meal is going to take somewhere on the order of 16 to 36 hours to make its way fully from mouth to anus. So you're still processing food that you took in yesterday to a certain extent. Now that long, slow process not only means more opportunity to break it down and more time to absorb everything that you're getting from it, it also means that you can take in another meal while you are still processing a previous one. In other words, an alimentary canal allows an animal to take in food more effectively. It can finish a meal, start breaking it down, and extracting nutrients from it, and have another meal immediately queued up. That means that the animal can more effectively manage its resources. It can keep a more continuous stream of nutrients coming in because you can always have another meal in the queue, assuming you can find something to eat that is stacked up behind the one that you're currently processing and getting ready to be processed. This ensures that the animal body, which as you've seen is much more energetically expensive than the bodies of, or the structures of plants or fungi, that animals have the high energy that they need in order to carry out the very expensive tasks involved in being an animal, such as movements. It should not come as a surprise to you that most cnidarians, as animals that do not have an alimentary canal, that have a gastrovascular cavity, most cnidarians are sessile. They are, remember that term, S-E-S-S-I-L-E, sessile means non-moving, that most of your cnidarians are things like corals or anemones or hydras that are rooted to one spot and barely ever move. Ergo, they don't have to spend a lot of energy on locomotion, which is good because they're not getting it as efficiently out of their food. Jellies are the most significant cnidarian group that engages in locomotion, and even then, they mostly drift in the water, being carried by currents and waves, occasionally contracting their body wall to move themselves closer to something tasty or warm or away from something noxious or cold. And therefore, they're not spending a lot of energy on locomotion either, nor do they have a complex nervous system to burn a lot of energy to. So, you see there's a direct correlation here, and this is not a coincidence, between the simplicity of the body plan and the efficiency with which it takes in energy. That whenever you're able to generate more energy, you can afford a more complex body plan. You can afford a thicker walled body with circulatory passageways and a complex nervous system and lots of musculature and so forth. Whereas with the limited nutritional absorption capacity of the gastrovascular cavity, you just don't have those calories to spare. All right, now digestive tracts are highly variable. Some animals have exceedingly simple digestive tracts. If you're looking at an earthworm, its digestive tract is basically one long continuous intestine. Essentially that tract is moving. The earthworm is the substrate feeder, that it is burrowing into the soil. It is ingesting soil. The soil is moving along the length of its entire tube-like digestive tract via peristalsis, and as it moves along, it's being churned up in there, and the worm is absorbing nutrients along the entire length of the wall. Basically, the whole wall is a mixing chamber and an absorption chamber, kind of a combination stomach plus intestine, without a lot of distinct compartmentalization. But you're going to find most animals with an alimentary canal have a much more sophisticated plan. They have more distinct structures. They have digestive organs along the way, each with particular jobs involved in the 4 steps of the digestive process. Now, by way of example, we could talk about all kinds of different animal digestive variations. Let's talk primarily here about the one we are most familiar with, the mammalian digestive tract, because mammals across the boards have a digestive tract very similar to ourselves. You're a mammal, and therefore it should come as no surprise. And although there are differences in diet and some important structural variations we'll talk about along the way, in general, the basic layout of the mammalian digestive tract is pretty universal. And so we'll go through this step by step, but I feel like the best way to do this is to talk about it sequentially. Let's go through the mammalian digestive tract from proximal end at the mouth to distal end at the anus. So we start at the mouth. The digestive tract begins there. That is the proximal opening by which food and fluids are taken into the animal's body. Now, some animals are going to have a round or sucker-like mouth. Consider a leech, which has a rounded mouth that allows it to latch on to the body of its prey. Its mouth is essentially a sphincter at the opening of the digestive tract, which opens and then has barbs, tooth-like protrusions that sink into the flesh of the prey and bind the animal in place. Your very simplest animals have sucker-like mouths. You're going to find that a lot of your arthropods, your insects, your crabs, and so forth, have a mouth that's basically a hole, again, a sphincter that opens and closes, surrounded by a small collection of specialized limbs. Look at a spider, and you'll see those little pedipalps, those little fang-looking things at the front of the animal's face. Those aren't fangs. Those are specialized organs for grasping and tearing apart food. Likewise, watch a crab or a lobster or a similar crustacean eat. You'll see a lot of little things going along, wiggling around its mouth. Those little wiggly parts are technically limbs, very specialized limbs that function as jaws. We often call them mandibles, the same term that is used for your jawbone, but they're not really a jaw as we understand it. Because the animals don't have a chewing behavior, they have these specialized facial appendages that grasp and tear apart their food and then push it into the mouth. Now, you are an example of a feature that is common to all vertebrates. Virtually all vertebrates. There are a couple of vertebrates that lack this. Very simple vertebrates like the lancelet, L-A-N-C-L-E-T, do not have what I'm about to tell you about. L-A-N-C-E-L-E-T, excuse me. But most vertebrates, including all reptiles, all amphibians, all fishes, all birds, I guess we should say all sauropodomorphs, bird plus reptile, all sharks, and all mammals, we all have a feature where we should say we are all a group of animals called the gnathostomes, G-N-A-T-H-O-S-T-O-M-E-S, if you don't remember that term from a previous lesson. A gnathostome is an animal with a hinged jaw. If an animal is agnathic, A-G-N-A-T-H-I-C, that means that it is a jawless animal. There's a variety of very primitive animals called jawless fishes that appeared in the earliest days of vertebrates, in which the mouth was basically a hole and a muscular sphincter. It had no chewing or biting capability. The evolution of a hinged jaw, early invertebrate evolution, right around 515 million years ago, was a really important innovation for the digestive tract. It allowed the animal to tear chunks of food away from larger masses, to scrape food from, say, like algae growing on rocks in an environment, to use the jaw as a weapon with which food can be grasped or killed, and finally, to engage in mastication. Mastication is one of those words that makes 12-year-olds giggle. M-A-S-T-I-C-A-T-I-O-N. Mastication is chewing. Not all animals have chewing behavior. Not even all gnathostomes have chewing behavior. But if you do have chewing behavior, it provides some very distinct benefits that we'll talk about in a few moments. So, food enters via the mouth and immediately passes into the oral cavity. The oral cavity is actually where we begin digestion. Now, some animals swallow their food whole. Some animals have no processing of the food in the mouth. A lot of fishes that prey on smaller fishes will just open their mouth and literally suck them in and swallow. They will not have any kind of oral food processing at all. A lot of amphibians, think about a frog that grabs a fly on its tongue, snaps it in, swallows it down. That animal does not chew the fly, So not all animals engage in oral food processing. But in mammals, remember we're talking about the mammal digestive tract here as our default, mammals are going to do some amount of food processing in the mouth. Now, some animals do swallow big chunks of their food whole. This is particularly the case for carnivores. Carnivores very often will engage in what we call bolting behavior. If you've watched a dog eat, they just kind of like, they get into their food real quick. They swallow it down very, very swiftly. They don't chew it a lot, largely because part of the predatory feeding strategy is bring down the animal and then eat your fill as quickly as you can, because in a lot of cases, that dead animal is going to become an attractive prize to other competing carnivores or scavengers. Ergo, it behooves you, evolutionarily speaking, to tear off your food, gobble it down quickly, fill your belly, and go, so that you don't have to defend your kill, or you don't have to fight off other animals trying to get their share. Some animals engage in behavior in which they take their prey somewhere else to eat it as a protective measure. It's not unusual, for example, for big cats in Africa like the cheetah or the jaguar to kill an animal and drag it up into a tree where it can then feed on it at its leisure. But you'll find that a lot of your carnivores, for that reason, don't have significant chewing behavior. Herbivores, on the other hand, have extensive chewing behavior. Herbivores are going to chew their food very, very, very thoroughly, in large part because an herbivore's food, by necessity, is going to contain a lot of tough plant fibers and sometimes things like shells, like you get around nuts or whatever. And therefore, you need a lot of processing. You need to break that up as much as possible. You need a lot of mechanical effort, and therefore the mouth is well suited to that. As an omnivore, we have chewing behavior for similar reasons. We process our food as much as possible in the mouth to get it started. Now, oral digestion has a couple of components. It has both enzymatic and mechanical components. The enzymatic component involves saliva, S-A-L-I-V-A. Saliva is a fluid secreted by several different glands. You have the salivary glands, some of which are located up here by your ears, the parotid glands they're called, P-A-R-O-T-I-D. And then you have the submandibular and sublingual glands, which you can guess by the name are at the bottom of the jaw and the bottom of the tongue. All of them secrete saliva, which is a mixture of serous and mucus fluids, both a watery lubricating fluid and a sticky binding fluid. Saliva has a couple of functions. It serves to bind together broken down food into a soft, squishy mass called a bolus, B-O-L-U-S, which is easier to swallow. Saliva also contains lysozymic enzymes, L-Y-S-O-Z-Y-M-E, lysozymes, which break down and kill bacteria present in the food. Saliva lubricates the food to make it easier to swallow. And saliva, most importantly for our purposes, contains several digestive enzymes. Specifically, digestion of carbohydrates begins in the mouth with the help of an enzyme called salivary amylase, A-M-Y-L-A-S-E, and lipid digestion begins in the mouth with lingual lipase, L-A-P-A-S-E. So we start the digestion of both fats and carbs in the mouth. We do not begin protein digestion in the mouth, and we'll get into why that is shortly. So that's the chemical component of digestion, and therefore mixing up the food in your mouth with saliva is beneficial for a number of reasons. One thing that helps with this is the tongue. T-O-N-G-U-E. The tongue is an organ that has a couple of functions. Obviously, we use it for speech, but the tongue is primarily an organ for two jobs, both of them digestive related. One of them is moving food around within the mouth, mixing it with saliva, shaping it into a bolus, and in some cases, shifting it between different kinds of teeth. More on that in a moment. The other thing that the tongue does, of course, is to taste the chemical content of the food. The tongue is covered in taste buds, which are simple chemoreceptive organs that contain taste cells, which are sensitive to the chemicals that you take in. You are probably aware that most animals can taste 5 basic flavors. Not all animals are equally good at all of them. You will find, for example, that your carnivores, like dogs and cats, are for the most part not very good at tasting sugars. They're not very good at tasting sweet things because their diet, as you know, doesn't really contain a lot of carbs. They're way better at tasting fats and proteins. The 5 basic taste sensations that you as an omnivore have, and yes, I said 5, you might think of 4 from your elementary school. Sweet, of course, which is the taste of carbs. Salty, the taste of metal ions. Sour, the taste of acidic compounds. Bitter, the taste of basic compounds. And the 5th one, which you may or may not know of, the taste called umami. U-M-A-M-I, and if that sounds like a silly word, that is because it is actually a slang word in Japanese. The word umami translates roughly as yummy or tasty, you know. Umami is a savory taste, the meaty taste that we associate with monosodium glutamate and with animal protein is tasted by that. So that is a much more prominent kind of taste bud in the mouths of your carnivores than in, say, your herbivores, which hardly have it at all. You have all of these. You've probably seen charts that show you, okay, you know, you're better at tasting sweet on the tip of your tongue and salty on the sides of your tongue, and no, that's not how it works. The one thing that is really true is bitter is best tasted on the back of the tongue because you have the largest concentration of big taste buds sensitive to bitter flavors arranged on the posterior of the tongue. And that's a very important evolutionary adaptation because bitter flavors are very commonly associated with toxins and with spoiled foods. A lot of the things that are toxic to us are alkaloid compounds. And therefore, bitter flavors in our food basically warn us, uh-oh, I'm about to consume something noxious. Putting bitter taste buds in a high concentration on the back of the tongue means that if we're about to swallow something noxious and nasty with a lot of bitter compounds in it, and it hits those bitter taste buds, it triggers a powerful gag reflex, which impels the animal to expel the bitter tasting thing and thereby, ideally, not take in whatever it is that's toxic or spoiled. So our bitter taste is actually our most sensitive taste. You're better at bitter than any other flavor. But which taste buds are going to be most sensitive are really going to be dependent on what kind of animal you are, what's your routine diet, what nutrients do you need to be able to detect effectively. Now, the other component of digestion in the oral cavity involves the teeth. And again, not all animals chew, but most vertebrates have some amount of chewing behavior. Now, chewing or mastication is facilitated by having a number of different teeth. Teeth are pretty universal across the animal kingdom. They have a hard crown covered in enamel, E-N-A-M-E-L, which is the hardest substance produced by the body. They have a white interior, a mineralized soft tissue called dentin, D-E-N-T-I-N, from which the root dentistry comes. They have an inner chamber called the pulp, P-U-L-P, where you find the blood supply and the nerve supply for the tooth. And then you have the roots, which anchors the tooth to the jaw. That tooth structure is basically universal. The presence of the hard enamel means teeth are the most durable part of your body. We have way more teeth in the fossil record than any other kind of animal tissue, way more even than bones, simply because teeth preserve better. They're so hard and they're so hard to break down. Now, not all teeth are equal. It all depends on how much chewing you need to do and what kind of diet you have. In fact, if you want to know the diet of an animal, if you want to know the default kind of food that that animal is adapted to feed upon, look at its teeth. The teeth will tell you the story. Because you need different kinds of teeth for processing meat than you do for processing plant fibers, for example. So you will find that your carnivores have teeth almost exclusively intended for the tearing, piercing, and processing of meat, lots of shearing and piercing kinds of teeth. Whereas your herbivores are going to have teeth that are largely, they have shearing teeth for cropping plants, but they also have a lot of grinding and crushing teeth for breaking down tough plant fibers and nutshells and that sort of thing. You are an omnivore, and like most omnivores, you are heterodont. Heterodont. Heterodont literally translates as different teeth. You have several different kinds of teeth. Whereas an animal with a less diverse diet is often homodont, Homodont, meaning that all of its teeth are the same. Now, look at your teeth. Look at your mouth. Okay, look. Now, see, we can look at our teeth upper and lower, right? You know what's called the dental arcade. The dental arcade is the arch of teeth that goes from one side of your mouth to the other. And if you're looking at it, from above, it's kind of a U-shaped curve, back of the jaw at either end here, curving around to the front of the jaw right there. And so you have an upper dental arcade and a lower dental arcade. Now, the way that we describe the number and types of teeth an animal has is using what's called a dental formula. And the dental formula is basically telling you what teeth you've got in one quadrant of your mouth. That is upper right, upper left, lower right, or lower left. Now, all animals, barring, I'm accepting situations in which teeth have been lost, have symmetrical teeth. That is, they're the animal kingdom in terms of bilateral development. You're going to have the same number of teeth on the left side of your body as on the right side of your body, again, barring abnormalities or teeth lost due to misadventure of some kind or what have you. But naturally, you've got symmetrical left and right sides of your jaw with the same numbers and types of teeth in each. That does not guarantee that you're going to have the same types of teeth top and bottom. It is not unusual in the animal kingdom to have different teeth in the upper jaw than in the lower jaw. As it happens, in humans, we have exactly the same kinds and numbers of teeth in both. That is the norm for most primates and for all apes. But in the animal kingdom, that is not necessarily universal. Now, if I'm spelling out what kinds and numbers of teeth my animal has, again, I'm looking at one quadrant of the jaw at the time. The dental formula will be written as a series of numbers over another series of numbers, like a fraction. The upper numbers are telling you which teeth are in one quadrant of the upper jaw, counting from the middle to the back. So in other words, I'll count how many teeth of X kind, Y kind, Z kind, going back, starting from the midline of the body, curving back towards the posterior of the dental arcade. So that set of numbers across the top in the dental formula is saying, okay, how many of each kind of tooth in order from middle to back, or medial to lateral, do I have in one quadrant of my upper jaw? The bottom number is saying, okay, how many teeth of what kind and in what order, medial to lateral, do I have in each quadrant of my lower jaw? So basically the numbers top and bottom in the dental formula are saying, how many teeth do I have in one half of my mouth, left and right? I mean top and bottom, I should say. Now, the human dental formula is good for illustrating the different kinds of teeth that are out there because as a heterodont animal, we have 4 distinct kinds of teeth. Your dental formula is 2, 1, 2, 3 over 2, 1, 2, 3. What does that mean? The 2's, the first number in each part of your dental formula, are your front teeth. These right here. Those are called your incisors, I-N-C-I-S-O-R. From the word incision, to cut, incisors are cutting teeth. They are for shearing through stuff. Incisors are found in both herbivores and carnivores because they're useful for both shearing through flesh and shearing through plant matter. So you're going to find that incisors are pretty common to things that have teeth in general. And they're usually found right in the front of the mouth because that's where you bite. That's where you crop off chunks of food from whatever larger mass you're taking your food from. Then if you go back from the incisors, continue from there, and the 2 is you have 1, 2 front teeth here, 1, 2 front teeth there. So each quadrant in your mouth has 2 incisors, 2, 4, 6, 8. You have a total of 8 incisors. Go back from there. The next number in your dental arcade is 1. One is the canine. You have one canine in each quadrant of your mouth. That is one here, and one each down there. So it's the third tooth back in each part of your quadrant. The canine is a small, pointy, kind of cone-shaped tooth with a sharp tip. Canines are piercing and tearing teeth. Canines are exclusively found in animals that prey on other animals. So carnivores and omnivores are the only animals that have canines. Because canines are for puncturing and tearing apart flesh. They're not much good to you if you're an herbivore. And so if you look at an animal's jaws, and if we find a fossil animal that we've never seen before, and we see canines in its jaws, we know that animal included some meat in its diet. Really, looking at teeth is the best way to figure out what an ancient animal was eating. Now, I should point out, we often call the canines our fang teeth, and you're probably aware that in wolves and a lot of other carnivorous animals, the canines are much, much larger than our canines. We have canines, but they're not terribly big. Even gorillas have much bigger canines than we do among the apes, and you'll find that in carnivorous animals, the canines tend to be big, curved, sharp, dangerous teeth, which are used as much as a weapon for killing prey as they are for tearing the flesh apart afterwards. Now, a lot of times we call the canines the fang teeth, the fangs of the wolf or the lion or the tiger or whatever, except that's wrong. Those aren't fangs. A fang has a very specific meaning in dentition. A fang is a specialized tooth for the delivery of venom. So the only way you have fangs is if you are venomous, if you have a venom that you're injecting into your prey, like a snake or like some lizards. So no, a wolf does not have fangs. We call them that colloquially. You'll even hear scientists call them the fangs, but that is not in fact accurate. It's not a fang unless it is delivering venom, in which case it has a hollow channel through the tooth for that purpose attached to a venom sac. And note that I say venom, not poison. And if you don't remember this rule, or if you haven't heard this elsewhere, venom is what you get when an animal injects it into you. Poison is an ingested thing. So poisons are ingested or they are contact. Venoms are injected, introduced in that way. The good rule of thumb is if it bites you and you die, it is venomous. If you bite it and you die, it is poisonous. So venomous animals. If an animal is poisonous, it's only poisonous if you eat part of that animal or if you touch part of that animal that then has a contact poison. Certain frogs, for example, the poison dart frog, as it's called, native to the Amazon rainforest, is so named because it secretes a neurotoxin called curare that can be delivered via touch. Or if you eat a polar bear liver, because of the very, very high levels of vitamin A, you'll get poison from vitamin A toxicity. But a cobra has venom. All right, so canines. Continue back in the dental arcade. The next number you might recall 2, 1, 2. We have another 2. And that means that you have in each quadrant of your mouth 2 premolars. P-R-E-M-O-L-A-R. Premolars are grinding teeth. They are there primarily to grind up tough plant fibers. If you are an herbivore, you're going to have more premolars, and you're going to have larger premolars with higher cusps and rougher, more crenellated surfaces to make an effective grinding tool. But you have them as well. And finally, going back distally from there, or back, I should say, laterally, the 3 teeth at the posterior of your mouth, the 2, 1, 2, 3, those last 3 are molars, M-O-L-A-R. Molars are crushing teeth. They are very similar in function to the premolar. They are for crushing up and grinding up tough plant fibers, again, larger, higher cusped, more numerous, and rougher in your herbivores than in your carnivores in general. Now, both molars and premolars, again, they're bigger and more numerous typically in your herbivores. You have some of them in omnivores like we do. And in your carnivores, molars and premolars are typically modified into a different kind of tooth. They are modified into a specialized tooth called a carnassial. C-A-R-N-A-S-S-I-A-L. Carnassials are basically modified molars and premolars with sharp cusps on them similar to a canine that effectively turns the premolar and molar into an additional tearing and piercing tooth, making it an effective weapon and an effective meat-tearing organ rather than a grinding organ for animals that don't really need to grind up the plant fibers as much. So our dental formula 2, 1, 2, 3 in each quadrant of the mouth. That's 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, 3 molars. That is, if you were doing the math on there, going to be 8 teeth in each quadrant of your mouth. That means a total of 32 teeth in your adult dentition. As a kid, of course, you have the baby teeth. You only have 20 baby teeth. Child baby formula in humans is 2, 1, 2, 3. Sorry, 2, 1, 2, my bad. In that as a kid, you have 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 molars. You do not have premolars. Those come in with the adult dentition. And kids only have 2 molars. In fact, you, listening to this, depending on how old you are, you may not have your 3rd molars yet, because the 3rd molar does not typically erupt until relatively late in your development. Specifically, your 3rd molars do not usually come in until you're in your late 20s. That's why we call them the wisdom teeth, because presumably you've gained some wisdom by that point in time. And the 3rd molar is a vestigial tooth in us. We do not really need it. Hominids have developed cookery. We cook our food. Homo sapiens were not the first animals to do this. Homo erectus did this. A few other early humans did this as well. But since we cook our food and process it more thoroughly before we chew, we don't need the tough power of the heaviest grinding teeth in the back of our mouth anymore. So your wisdom teeth are actually vestigial teeth. And like most vestigial organs, they've accumulated a lot of weird mutations over time, which is why your wisdom teeth so often come in sideways or don't fully erupt or whatever and eventually have to be removed, or in some people, never erupt at all. All right, so you can see looking at the teeth, we learn an awful lot about the animal's diets, and we have different ways of processing different kinds of food. So you put the food in your mouth, you begin masticating or chewing it. Again, some animals don't do this, but most animals have some amount of chewing behavior. You're shifting it around in your mouth. The tongue is moving it between different kinds of teeth to give it different kinds of processing. Also mixing it up with saliva and shaping it into a soft mass called a bolus. Then, finally, once you're done with that, it's time for deglutition, D-E-G-L-U-T-I-T-I-O-N, which is the fancy term for swallowing, during which the tongue pushes the bolus of food up against the roof of your mouth, against the hard palates, P-A-L-A-T-E. You can feel that hard area on with the top of your mouth with your tongue, and then shoves it from there down into your throat. If you are a reptile, you don't do this chewing, you're going to swallow your food whole. Now, interesting thing about that, one of the cool features of being a mammal is that you have a hard palate, that you have a plate of bone between the oral and nasal cavities. And that's a really important adaptation for being warm-blooded, because it means you can chew and breathe at the same time. And that means that you don't have to reduce your oxygen intake while you are processing your food. And it also means that you can break the food up more thoroughly in your mouth because you don't have to hold your breath while you're doing it. If you have a pet lizard, if you ever know anybody who does, watch somebody feed their pet lizard sometime. You give it a leaf and it goes, swallows, bites off another bit, swallows it whole. It doesn't take the time to chew because it can't. There's no separation in the oral and nasal cavities, so the animal has to hold its breath while it's swallowing food and while it's processing food. So it doesn't have the time to chew it. This is an important feature for being a warm-blooded animal, because you can break apart the food more thoroughly in the mouth before it even gets to lower digestive organs. Breaking it apart increases its surface area. Therefore, you can digest it more quickly and more thoroughly, ergo extracting more energy per unit of food, and for a warm-blooded critter, that's exceedingly important. So, swallow the food. Deglutition enters the pharynx, P-H-A-R-Y-N-X, which is the throat. Passes first into the oropharynx, O-R-O-pharynx, which is the part of the throat right behind the mouth. Passes from there down into the laryngopharynx, L-A-R-Y-N-G-O-P-H-A-R-Y-N-X, because that word hates you and does not want you to know how to spell it properly. The laryngopharynx is the bridge between the oropharynx and the esophagus, or food tube. As you swallow the food, the laryngopharynx has 2 openings, one that goes down to the esophagus, one that goes down to your lower respiratory tract. It's called laryngopharynx because it's by the larynx, or voice box. There's an opening there called the glottis, G-O-L-T-T-I-S, that leads into the larynx, or voice box. We want to close that when we're swallowing. You've all had the uncomfortable experience of food going down the wrong pipe. And you normally have a little flap of tissue called the epiglottis, epiglottis. The epiglottis is a little elastic cartilage that folds over the glottis, closing off the opening to the digestive tract when you swallow, assuming all goes well. So your food gets to the bottom of the pharynx, presses against a sphincter at the bottom of the pharynx, and moves into the esophagus, esophagus, or food tube. The esophagus connects pharynx to stomach. It has a muscular sphincter at either end. There's a pharyngeal sphincter, or upper esophageal sphincter, and a lower esophageal sphincter, sometimes called the cardiac sphincter, because it's located near the heart. Food goes into the esophagus, is moved down the esophagus by peristalsis, Peristalsis. Peristalsis is a wave of muscular contraction that drives the food ahead of it, kind of like when you're squeezing toothpaste from the bottom of the tube towards the top. So that peristaltic wave moves down the esophagus, pushing the food down to the bottom. Pressure of the food against the lower esophageal sphincter causes it to open, dumping the food into the stomach. Now, if you're a bird, you have another feature. Birds will very often have a little muscular sac attached to the esophagus called a crop or gizzard, C-R-O-P or G-I-Z-Z-A-R-T. The crop or gizzard, which you can often see on the throat of like a chicken or something, is a sac on the animal's esophagus, which houses small stones, which are often used to help grind up plant matter, and also houses populations of microbiotic organisms, which can help to break down certain compounds that are otherwise hard to digest. Birds rely on a lot of microorganisms for many parts of their digestion, so the crop is a very useful organ for them. So, drop the food next into the stomach, S-T-O-M-A-C-H. The stomach is a muscular walled mixing chamber in the stomach. Your food is going to be combined with acid, specifically hydrochloric acid, HCl, and with gastric juice, G-A-S-T-R-I-C. Gastric juice contains a number of digestive enzymes, most notably pepsin, P-E-P-S-I-N, which is the protein digesting enzyme. Protein digestion begins in the stomach, and the reason for that is because the stomach has a mucus lining that protects it against being digested by its own digestive enzymes and being damaged by its own digestive acids. The lining of the stomach is protected against that. Lining of your oral cavity is not. The oral cavity is nowhere near as acidic as the stomach. Pepsin, as an enzyme, requires a pH of around 2 or 3 to operate, and therefore it's not going to be activated until it is emptied into the stomach. That's important because that way the protein digesting enzyme does not digest the glands producing it or the ducts carrying it to the stomach. Ergo, it only activates once it gets into that defended chamber with a nice protective lining, so that then it begins to break down proteins. Incidentally, if that mucus lining gets broken down, pepsin and acid can damage the inner wall of the stomach, which can then be colonized by bacteria, giving you what we call ulcers, U-L-C-E-R. An ulcer is actually a bacterial infection in the lining of the stomach wall. Now, in the stomach, it's going to have smooth muscle walls, which churn up the food, mixing it thoroughly with digestive juices. The acids complete the physical digestion of the food, breaking it apart as it's churned up in there. And the enzymes in there continue to work on the chemical parts of the food. There is very little nutrient absorption in the stomach. The stomach is primarily a mixing chamber and a place to complete physical digestion and to continue chemical digestion. What you eventually produce in the stomach is an acidic broth called acid chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, or just chyme for short. Depending on what you're digesting, your meal will stay in your stomach for varying lengths of time. Carbs digest faster, proteins and fats take a lot longer. Therefore, you will find that carnivores tend to have much larger stomachs, which can hold that bulky animal matter that they largely didn't chew, store it for a long time so that meal can spend a while in their stomach being slowly broken down. Whereas you will find herbivores have stomachs that process more rapidly, but what herbivores often have is a series of stomachs. It is not unusual for a ruminant animal like a cow or a deer to have 3 or 4 stomachs in sequence, which subject the food to additional processing to help break down all that tough cellulose. In fact, periodically you will find that a lot of herbivores will regurgitate masses of food called cud, C-U-D, and they will chew it more. They'll break it apart more and then re-swallow it to help the stomach out. So if you ever see a cow just sitting in a field chewing their cud, yeah, it's an additional stage of digestion. They basically just threw up a little bit of their food in their mouth, chewed it up more, and then swallowed it down again. Yummy. All right, so we move through our one or more stomachs, and then at the distal end of the stomach, if you've heard me using these terms, proximal is the beginning end of a tube, distal is the far end of a tube. So at the distal end of the stomach, we have a sphincter called the pyloric sphincter, P-Y-L-O-R-I-C, which opens into the small intestine. Now, the only thing small about the small intestine is its diameter compared to the large intestine. It's a narrow little tube, maybe about the thickness of your finger, but you have a lot of small intestine, about 6 to 6.5 meters of small intestine coiled up in your abdomen. The small intestine is the chief organ of both chemical digestion and absorption. We finish chemical digestion here, and we absorb almost all of your nutrients here. First portion of the small intestine is called the duodenum, D-U-O-D-E-N-U-M. You notice I did that kind of loop movement with my hand because in us, the duodenum curves around the head of the pancreas in sort of a U-like shape. The duodenum is only about 25 centimeters long, about a quarter of a meter in humans. But the duodenum is where you do most of your chemical digestion, much more than the stomach, in fact. Chemical digestion is largely completed in the duodenum. It's going to be containing a lot of enzymes brought in from the pancreas and the liver. The pancreas provides so-called pancreatic juice. By the way, it's P-A-N-C-R-E-A-S. The pancreas is an interesting gland because it's both an endocrine and an exocrine gland. The endocrine function, of course, is the production of insulin. We're not going to talk about that right now. But the exocrine function is the production of a digestive fluid called pancreatic juice. Pancreatic juice is conducted to the duodenum through various small channels called pancreatic ducts. Pancreatic juice contains enzymes that digest proteins, carbs, fats, and lipids. It also has an alkaloid component that neutralizes the acid coming in from the stomach. The liver is supplying a different digestive fluid called bile, B-I-L-E. Bile is a yellowish-green fluid that the liver produces by taking bilirubin, B-I-L-I-R-U-B-I-N, which is a compound from broken down red blood cells, combining that bilirubin with hormones, salts, and fats to make a material called bile. Bile is stored by the gallbladder, G-A-L-L-B-L-A-D-D-R, which is a little sac attached to the liver, and then is released through ducts into the duodenum, where bile helps us to digest fat. Bile specifically emulsifies fats, breaking them apart into small beads, making it easier for the lipases found in pancreatic juice to break them down. Your liver incidentally reabsorbs most of the bile salts that are used to make bile, and then uses them by combining them with bilirubin in the gallbladder to make more bile. Your liver makes about a liter of bile every single day. Now, you can reuse the bile salts if you've got a gallbladder. The gallbladder is one of those organs you can technically live without. If it has to be surgically removed, you'll be okay, but you're going to have a harder time digesting fats from that point onward because your liver can't effectively store and concentrate bile as well as it did previously. You can still make bile, but it's not as good. So we finish chemical digestion in the duodenum. We begin absorption of our nutrients in the duodenum. You will find that the small intestine is lined with little finger-like protrusions about 1 millimeter long each called villi, V-I-L-L-I. Villi are going to project into the lumen or interior space of the small intestine. L-U-M-E-N is a space inside of any body structure. They are going to be covered in little tiny fibers, microscopic fibers, called microvilli. And the villi and the microvilli have two jobs. One, they are going to increase the overall surface area inside the large intestine, making it more surface to absorb nutrients. With the help of villi and microvilli, your intestines have a surface area internally that's 300 times greater than if it was a smooth tube. The villi contain both capillaries with the smallest blood vessels, and lacteals, Lacteals, which are your lymphatic vessels, and they are there to absorb fats. Lacteals absorb fats, capillaries absorb the other nutrients from your food. So as the food moves along the length of the small intestine via peristalsis, it is going to, little by little, soak up those nutrients. Having more surface area means it's better at doing that. So this is a great advantage to be able to have greater surface area in order to fully take in as many nutrients as possible. Now that begins in the duodenum, continues in the next portion of the small intestine, which is called the jejunum, J-E-J-N-U-M. What's it? J-E-J-U-N. J-E-J-U-N-U-M. J-E-J-U-N-U-M. Sorry, got lost in my spelling bee there that I was doing in my head. The jejunum is the second portion of the small intestine. In humans, it's about 2 meters long, primary organ of absorption. We absorb most nutrients there. And then finally, from the jejunum, we move on to the ileum, I-L-E-U-M. Be careful of that spelling. Hang on a second. This is Mina. Hi, Mina. Say hi to my students. All right, but anyhow, the ileum is, be careful of that spelling because there's another word in your body pronounced ileum, I-L-I-U-M. That's part of your hip bone. But the ileum, I-L-E-U-M, is going to finish absorption. It's going to absorb most things not captured by the jejunum. It's about 3.5 meters long, and it also contains lymphatic tissue called Peyer's patches, capital P-E-Y-E-R, named for the guy who found them. Peyer's patches contain immune cells, which are there to help fight off pathogens, bacteria, and so forth that have managed to get that far in your digestive tract. Ileum's longer than the jejunum. Ileum is about 3.5 meters long in humans. At the end of the ileum, it's going to join up with the large intestine at the ileocecal junction, I-L-E-O-C-E-C-A-L, which is a sphincter there that controls the access. Now, okay, we can get down. Thank you. Thank you for your help, Mina. All right, so from the ileocecal junction, we move into the last portion of the digestive tract, which is the large intestine. Shorter than the small intestine. In humans, it's about 1.8 meters long, but wider. Now, the large intestine is going to have bands of muscle that go all the way along its length. You primarily move things from the small intestine via so-called circular muscles that are going to engage in peristalsis along its length. The large intestine has a band of muscle along its whole length called the Teniae coli, T-E-N-I-A-E-C-O-L-I, Teniae coli, 2 words, which is going to slowly churn up the contents of the large intestine and move them along bit by bit. Now, the large intestine is where we finish the last processing tasks. We reabsorb a few things that we want the body to keep, and we get rid of the wastes. Large intestine has 3 parts. First off, we have the cecum, C-E-C-U-M. This is a sac right after the ileocecal junction, where food, or rather I should say not food, at this point, undigested material, fluids from the rest of the digestive tract, that's pretty much what goes into the cecum. If you're an herbivore, you have a much larger cecum, which can expand to hold tough plant matter, which is still being processed at this point by your colon. You as an omnivore do not digest cellulose, and therefore you have a smaller cecum. Attached to the cecum, you're going to find a little wormy organ called the vermiform appendix, A-P-P-E-N-D-I-X. The appendix, we thought for a long time, was a vestigial digestive organ. We now know that the appendix is a lymphatic organ, that it contains lymphatic tissue like the Peyer's patches to help protect you against foodborne pathogens. You don't need an appendix, you'll do just fine without it, which is good because periodically the appendix gets blocked up, infected, and you develop appendicitis, A-P-P-E-N-D-I-C-I-T-I-S, which can be lethal if the appendix is not clipped out, but you don't need that appendix. Now, from the cecum, slow movements of the large intestine, which we call mass movements, shift the non-digested material into the colon, C-O-L-O-N, which is the largest portion of the large intestine. In humans, the colon goes up the right side of our abdomen, that's the ascending colon, across the abdomen from left to right, from right to left, I should say, that's the transverse colon, down the left side of our abdomen, that's the descending colon, and then curves into a sort of S-shaped loop at the end called the sigmoid colon, S-I-G-M-O-I-D. The colon does a couple of things. For starters, the colon reabsorbs water and salts from the rest of the digestive tract because your intestines, your stomach, passed a lot of fluids along. The colon is our primary source of fluid recapture. It absorbs up to 6 liters of water per day, as well as salts, sodium, potassium, and so forth, that otherwise would have been dissolved in that fluid and been lost by the body. If the colon gets irritated, you develop diarrhea, when you pass out a lot of water along with the stool. And that can be a lethal condition, by the way, if it persists long enough, because your body becomes dehydrated, since the colon is where it recaptures water. There's a disease called cholera, C-H-O-L-E-R-A. No, you don't see it a whole lot here in the Western world, but in a lot of developing countries, it is still a lethal menace. And in the early part of American history, very lethal menace as well. There were cholera outbreaks. Now, the colon reabsorbs water and certain salts. It also completes the digestion of a very few nutrients. Your colon contains populations of bacteria. We call that your microbiome. M-I-C-R-O-B-I-O-M-E. The microbiome consists of more than 700 known species of bacteria, which, among other things, help us to process certain vitamins, like vitamin K, folic acid, and riboflavin, which are then absorbed through the walls of the colon. Those bacteria do break down a little bit of fat and carbohydrates that has not been digested previously, and absorb those few salts and fats as well. If you are an herbivore, some of those bacteria also break down cellulose. Remember that tough plant fiber that in your body is just the dietary fiber you can't digest? Well, if you're an herbivore, this is where it gets processed. You have bacteria in your colon that break down the cellulose using the cellulase enzyme, and you absorb the sugars released from that. This is the primary organ of absorption for you if you're an herbivore, because that's where you're taking in the bulk of calories from the tough plant fibers that most animals cannot digest. Actually, you can't either without the help of those symbiotic bacteria. We don't have bacteria that do that, and that's good, because as an omnivore, you rely on those plant fibers to add bulk to your feces, F-E-C-E-S. Speaking of, that's the last job of the colon. It makes feces. It compacts all the other stuff that is non-digestible fibers, dead cells, and bacteria into the waste masses that we call the feces. And the colon slowly compacts the feces together, little bit by little bit, moves them along. In our bodies, you'll spend 18 to 24 hours in the colon. At the distal end of the colon, feces are emptied into the rectum, R-E-C-T-U-M. That's a muscular walled storage chamber. When the walls of the rectum become stretched, it sends a signal not to your brain, but to your spinal cord. The base of your spinal cord has a structure called the conus medullaris, C-O-N-U-S, medullaris, M-E-D-U-L-L-A-R-I-S. The conus medullaris contains the defecation center, the neurological center that controls the defecation reflex, D-E-F-E-C-A-T-I-O-N, or the release of solid wastes. Stretching in the wall of the rectum informs you, hey, you got solid waste you need to eliminate. Now, when you're a baby, you don't know how to control that reflex, you just let them go. But, of course, the rest of us have learned how to do that. So when the defecation center sends a signal back to the rectum, it opens up an internal anal sphincter inside of the rectum, which releases the feces down into the anal canal. Anal canal terminates at a distal sphincter, the external anal sphincter, better known as the anus, A-N-U-S. Internal anal sphincter is smooth muscle. You have no control over it. Pressure of feces against it will make it open, and you get a signal to your spinal cord. Then your brain finds out, hey, I need to let the wastes go. But once you're past the age of 2 or so, you know how to control the external anal sphincter, and you can choose when to open it in order to release feces through the anus. One last thing I want to point out here is that if you are a bird or certain reptiles, you only have one duct for the release of wastes. We have 2 separate ways to release wastes. We have the anus, and we have the urethra, which releases chemical wastes and liquid wastes processed by the urinary system. If you are a bird or certain reptiles, you only have one port called the cloaca, C-L-O-A-C-A. The cloaca is a common passage used for both liquid and solid wastes. basically the animal's urinary system empties into the cloaca just as its digestive system empties into the cloaca. This is why the feces of birds tend to be watery, because that's their urine plus their feces. To make things even more disgusting, if you are certain birds or reptiles, the cloaca is also your reproductive tract. It's also the passage by which sperm are passed to the egg from male to female. But we'll talk about that when we talk about animal reproductive systems. Colon tends to be longer in herbivores for fairly obvious reasons. It's doing most of the processing of cellulose fiber, and therefore it has to be longer and larger, bigger expanded cecum, and more length of colon in order to accommodate more time for nutrient breakdown and absorption. All right, folks, and I think that gives us a pretty good tour of animal digestive systems. I've run a little bit longer than I normally go, but otherwise I was going to have a weird little 15-minute lecture to close off this section. So we are done with animal nutrition and digestion. Next up, we're going to have to talk about what do we do with those nutrients next. Once they've been taken in, they got to be absorbed, right? One last thing. From the small intestine, those nutrients get channeled to the liver. Liver gets first crack at them. Liver stores some of them for future use. Liver converts some nutrients into other nutrients. And then it passes them on to general circulation to be distributed to the rest of the body. Speaking of, next thing we'll talk about will be circulation. But that'll be in a future lesson. Thank you for your time, folks. Hope you're having a good day. Talk to you soon.